This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Chip in Tampa, Florida, on March 15th, 2006. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 1. Breton. My godmother lived in a handsome house in the clean and ancient town of Breton. Her husband's family had been residents there for generations, and bore indeed the name of their birthplace, Breton of Breton. Whether by coincidence, or because some remote ancestor had been a personage of sufficient importance to leave his name to his neighbourhood, I know not. When I was a girl, I went to Breton about twice a year, and well I liked the visit. The house and its inmates specially suited me. The large, peaceful rooms, the well-arranged furniture, the clear, wide windows, the balcony outside, looking down on a fine antique street where Sundays and holidays seemed always to abide, so quiet was its atmosphere, so clean its pavement. These things pleased me well. One child in a household of grown people is usually made very much of, and in a quiet way I was a good deal taken notice of by Mrs. Breton, who had been left a widow with one son before I knew her, her husband, a physician, having died while she was yet a young and handsome woman. She was not young as I remember her, but she was still handsome, tall, well-made, and though dark for an Englishwoman, yet wearing all the clearness of health in her brunette cheek, and its vivacity in a pair of fine, cheerful black eyes. People esteemed it a grievous pity that she had not conferred her complexion on her son, whose eyes were blue, though even in boyhood very piercing, and the colour of his long hair such as friends did not venture to specify, except as the sun shone on it when they called it golden. He inherited the lines of his mother's features, however, also her good teeth, her stature, or the promise of her stature, for he was not yet full grown, and, what was better, her health without flaw, and her spirits of that tone and equality which are better than a fortune to the possessor. In the autumn of that year I was staying at Breton, my godmother having come in person to claim me of the kinfolk with whom was at that time fixed my permanent residence. I believe she then plainly saw events coming, whose very shadow I scarce guessed, yet of which the faint suspicion sufficed to impart unsettled sadness, and made me glad to change scene and society. Time always flowed smoothly for me at my godmother's side, not with tumultuous swiftness, but blandly, like the gliding of a full river through a plain. My visits to her resembled the sojourn of a Christian and hopeful beside a certain pleasant stream, with green trees on each bank, and meadows beautified with lilies all the year round. The charm of variety there was not, nor the excitement of incident, but I liked peace so well, and sought stimulus so little, that when the latter came I almost felt it a disturbance, and wished rather it had still held aloof. One day a letter was received, of which the contents evidently caused Mrs. Breton surprise and some concern. I thought at first it was from home, and trembled, expecting I know not what disastrous communication to me. However, no reference was made, and the cloud seemed to pass. The next day, on my return from a long walk, I found, as I entered my bedroom, an unexpected change. In addition to my own French bed in its shady recess, appeared in a corner a small crib draped with white, and in addition to my mahogany chest of drawers I saw a tiny rosewood chest. I stood still, gazed, and considered. "Of what are these things the signs and tokens?" I asked. The answer was obvious. "A second guest is coming. Mrs. Breton expects other visitors." On descending to dinner, explanations ensued. A little girl, I was told, would shortly be my companion, the daughter of a friend and distant relation of the late Dr. Bretton's. This little girl, it was added, had recently lost her mother, though indeed Mrs. Bretton ere long subjoined the loss was not so great as might at first appear. Mrs. Home it seems was the name, had been a very pretty but a giddy, careless woman, who had neglected her child, and disappointed and disheartened her husband. So far from congenial had the union proved, that separation at last ensued, separation by mutual consent, not after any legal process. Soon after this event, the lady, having overexerted herself at a ball, caught cold, took a fever, and died after a very brief illness. Her husband, naturally a man of very sensitive feelings, and shocked inexpressibly by too sudden communication of the news, could hardly, it seems, now be persuaded but that some over-severity on his part, some deficiency in patience and indulgence, had contributed to hasten her end. He had brooded over this idea till his spirits were seriously affected. The medical men insisted on travelling being tried as a remedy, and meanwhile Mrs. Bretton had offered to take charge of his little girl. "And I hope," added my godmother in conclusion, "the child will not be like her mamma, as silly and frivolous a little flirt as ever a sensible man was weak enough to marry. For," said she, "Mr. Home is a sensible man in his way, though not very practical. He is fond of science, and lives half his life in a laboratory trying experiments, a thing his butterfly wife could neither comprehend nor endure. And indeed," confessed my godmother, "I should not have liked it myself." In answer to a question of mine, she further informed me that her late husband used to say Mr. Home had derived this scientific turn from a maternal uncle, a French savant, for he came, it seems, of mixed French and Scottish origin, and had connections now living in France, of whom more than one wrote de before his name, and called himself noble. That same evening, at 9 o'clock, a servant was dispatched to meet the coach by which our little visitor was expected. Mrs. Bretton and I sat alone in the drawing-room, waiting her coming, John Graham Bretton being absent on a visit to one of his schoolfellows who lived in the country. My godmother read the evening paper while she waited. I sewed. It was a wet night. The rain lashed the panes, and the wind sounded angry and restless. "Poor child!" said Mrs. Bretton from time to time. "What weather for her journey! I wish she were safe here." A little before 10 the door-bell announced Warren's return. No sooner was the door opened than I ran down into the hall. There lay a trunk and some bandboxes. Beside them stood a person like a nurse-girl, and at the foot of the staircase was Warren with a shawled bundle in his arms. "Is that the child?" I asked. "Yes, miss." I would have opened the shawl and tried to get a peep at the face, but it was hastily turned from me to Warren's shoulder. "Put me down, please," said a small voice, when Warren opened the drawing-room door. "And take off this shawl," continued the speaker, extracting with its minute hand the pin, and with a sort of fastidious haste doffing the clumsy wrapping. The creature which now appeared made a deft attempt to fold the shawl, but the drapery was much too heavy and large to be sustained or wielded by those hands and arms. "Give it to Harriet, please," was then the direction, "and she can put it away." This said, it turned and fixed its eyes on Mrs. Bretton. "Come here, little dear," said that lady. "Come and let me see if you are cold and damp, and let me warm you at the fire." The child advanced promptly. Relieved of her wrapping, she appeared exceedingly tiny, but was a neat, completely fashioned little figure, light, slight, and straight. Seated on my godmother's ample lap, she looked a mere doll. Her neck, delicate as wax, her head of silky curls, increased, I thought, the resemblance. Mrs. Bretton talked in little fond phrases as she chafed the child's hands, arms, and feet. First she was considered with a wistful glance, but soon a smile answered her. Mrs. Bretton was not generally a caressing woman, even with her deeply cherished son. Her manner was rarely sentimental, often the reverse. But when the small stranger smiled at her, she kissed it, asking, "What is my little one's name?" "Missy." "But besides Missy?" "Polly, Papa calls her." "Will Polly be content to live with me?" "Not always, but till Papa comes home. Papa is gone away." She shook her head expressively. "He will return to Polly, or send for her." "Will he, ma'am? Do you know he will?" "I think so." "But Harriet thinks not. At least not for a long while. He is ill." Her eyes filled. She drew her hand from Mrs. Bretton's and made a movement to leave her lap. It was at first resisted, but she said, "Please, I wish to go. I can sit on a stool." She was allowed to slip down from the knee, and, taking a footstool, she carried it to a corner where the shade was deep, and there seated herself. Mrs. Bretton, though a commanding, and in grave matters even a peremptory woman, was often passive in trifles. She allowed the child her way. She said to me, "Take no notice at present." But I did take notice. I watched Polly raise her small elbow on her small knee, her head on her hand. I observed her draw a square inch or two of pocket-handkerchief from the doll pocket of her doll's skirt, and then I heard her weep. Other children in grief or pain cry aloud, without shame or restraint, but this being wept. The tiniest occasional sniff testified to her emotion. Mrs. Bretton did not hear it, which was quite as well. Ere long, a voice issuing from the corner demanded, "May the bell be rung for Harriet?" I rang. The nurse was summoned, and came. "Harriet, I must be put to bed," said her little mistress. "You must ask where my bed is." Harriet signified that she had already made that inquiry. "Ask if you sleep with me, Harriet." "No, missy," said the nurse. "You are to share this young lady's room," designating me. Missy did not leave her seat, but I saw her eyes seek me. After some minutes' silent scrutiny, she emerged from her corner. "I wish you, ma'am, good night," said she to Mrs. Bretton, but she passed me mute. "Good night, Polly," I said. "No need to say good night, since we sleep in the same chamber," was the reply, with which she vanished from the drawing-room. We heard Harriet propose to carry her upstairs. "No need," was again her answer. "No need, no need." And her small step toiled wearily up the staircase. On going to bed an hour afterwards, I found her still wide awake. She had arranged her pillows so as to support her little person in a sitting posture. Her hands, placed one within another, rested quietly on the sheet, with an old-fashioned calm, most unchildlike. I abstained from speaking to her for some time, but just before extinguishing the light, I recommended her to lie down. "By and by," was the answer. "But you will take cold, missy." She took some tiny article of raiment from the chair at her crib-side, and with it covered her shoulders. I suffered her to do as she pleased. Listening a while in the darkness, I was aware that she still wept under restraint, quietly and cautiously. On awakening with daylight, a trickling of water caught my ear. Behold! There she was, risen and mounted on a stool near the washstand, with pains and difficulty inclining the ewer, which she could not lift, so as to pour its contents into the basin. It was curious to watch her as she washed and dressed, so small, busy, and noiseless. Evidently she was little accustomed to perform her own toilette, and the buttons, strings, hooks, and eyes offered difficulties which she encountered with a perseverance good to witness. She folded her nightdress. She smoothed the drapery of her couch quite neatly, withdrawing into a corner, where the sweep of the white curtain concealed her. She became still. I half rose and advanced my head to see how she was occupied. On her knees, with her forehead bent on her hands, I perceived that she was praying. Her nurse tapped at the door. She started up. "I am dressed, Harriet," said she. "I have dressed myself, but I do not feel neat. Make me neat." "Why did you dress yourself, missy?" "Hush, speak low, Harriet, for fear of waking the girl," meaning me, who now lay with my eyes shut. "I dressed myself to learn, against the time you leave me." "Do you want me to go?" "When you are cross. I have many a time wanted you to go, but not now. Tie my sash straight, make my hair smooth, please." "Your sash is straight enough. What a peculiar little body you are." "It must be tied again. Please to tie it." "There, then. When I am gone, you must get that young lady to dress you." "On no account." "Why? She is a very nice young lady. I hope you mean to behave prettily to her, missy, and not show her your airs." "She shall dress me on no account." "Comical little thing! You are not passing the comb straight through my hair, Harriet. The line will be crooked." "Ay, you are ill to please. Does that suit?" "Pretty well. Where should I go, now that I am dressed?" "I will take you to the breakfast room." "Come, then." They proceeded to the door. She stopped. "Oh, Harriet, I wish this was papa's house. I don't know these people." "Be a good child, missy." "I am good, but I ache here," putting her hand to her heart, and moaning while she reiterated, "Papa, papa." "Say good morning to the young lady," dictated Harriet. She said, "Good morning," and then followed her nurse from the room. Harriet temporarily left that same day to go to her own friends who lived in the neighbourhood. On descending, I found Paulina, the child called herself Polly, but her full name was Paulina Mary, seated at the breakfast table by Mrs. Bretton's side. A mug of milk stood before her, a morsel of bread filled her hand, which lay passive on the tablecloth. She was not eating. "How shall we conciliate this little creature?" said Mrs. Bretton to me. "I don't know. She tastes nothing, and by her looks she has not slept." I expressed my confidence in the effects of time and kindness. "If she were to take a fancy to anybody in the house, she would soon settle." "But not till then," replied Mrs. Bretton. So ends Chapter 1. Bretton.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 2. Paulina. Some days elapsed, and it appeared she was not likely to take much of a fancy to anybody in the house. She was not exactly naughty or wilful. She was far from disobedient, but an object less conducive to comfort, to tranquillity even, than she presented, it was scarcely possible to have before one's eyes. She moped. No grown person could have performed that uncheering business better. No furrowed face of adult exile longing for Europe at Europe's antipodes ever bore more legibly the signs of homesickness than did her infant visage. She seemed growing old and unearthly. I, Lucy Snowe, plead guiltless of that curse, an overheated and discursive imagination, but whenever opening a room door I found her seated in a corner alone, her head in her pygmy hand. That room seemed to me not inhabited, but haunted. And again, when of moonlight nights on waking I beheld her figure, white and conspicuous in its nightdress, kneeling upright in bed, and praying like some Catholic or Methodist enthusiast, some precocious fanatic or untimely saint, I scarcely know what thoughts I had, but they ran risk of being hardly more rational and healthy than that child's mind must have been. I seldom caught word of her prayers, for they were whispered low sometimes. Indeed, they were not whispered at all, but put up unuttered. Such rare sentences as reached my ear still bore the burden, "Papa, my dear papa." This, I perceived, was a one-ideaed nature, betraying that monomaniac tendency I have ever thought the most unfortunate, with which man or woman can be cursed. What might have been the end of this fretting had it continued unchecked, can only be conjectured. It received, however, a sudden turn. One afternoon, Mrs. Bretton, coaxing her from her usual station in a corner, had lifted her into the window seat, and, by way of occupying her attention, told her to watch the passengers and count how many ladies should go down the street in a given time. She had sat listlessly, hardly looking and not counting, when, my eye being fixed on hers, I witnessed in its iris and pupil a startling transfiguration. These sudden dangerous natures, sensitive as they are called, offer many a curious spectacle to those whom a cooler temperament has secured from a participation in their angular vagaries. The fixed and heavy gaze swum, trembled, then glittered in fire. The small overcast brow cleared, the trivial and dejected features lit up, the sad countenance vanished, and in its place appeared a sudden eagerness, an intense expectancy. "It is," were her words. Like a bird or a shaft or any other swift thing, she was gone from the room. How she got the house door open I cannot tell. Probably it might be ajar. Perhaps Warren was in the way, and obeyed her behest, which would be impetuous enough. I, watching calmly from the window, saw her, in her black frock and tiny braided apron (to pinafore she had an antipathy), dart half the length of the street, and, as I was on the point of turning and quietly announcing to Mrs. Bretton that the child was run out mad, and ought instantly to be pursued, I saw her caught up and wrapped at once from my cool observation, and from the wondering stare of the passengers. A gentleman had done this good turn, and now, covering her with his cloak, advanced to restore her to the house whence he had seen her issue. I concluded he would leave her in a servant's charge and withdraw, but he entered. Having tarried a little while below, he came upstairs. His reception immediately explained that he was known to Mrs. Bretton. She recognised him, she greeted him, and yet she was fluttered, surprised, taken unawares. Her look and manner were even expostulatory, and in reply to these rather than her words, he said, "I could not help it, madam. I found it impossible to leave the country without seeing with my own eyes how she settled." "But you will unsettle her?" "I hope not. And how is papa's little Polly?" This question he addressed to Paulina, as he sat down and placed her gently on the ground before him. "How is Polly's papa?" was the reply, as she leaned on his knee and gazed up into his face. It was not a noisy, not a wordy scene; for that I was thankful; but it was a scene of feeling too brimful, and which, because the cup did not foam up high, or furiously overflow, only oppressed one the more. On all occasions of vehement unrestrained expansion, a sense of disdain or ridicule comes to the weary spectator's relief, whereas I have ever felt most burdensome that sort of sensibility which bends of its own will, a giant slave under the sway of good sense. Mr. Home was a stern-featured, perhaps I should rather say a hard-featured man. His forehead was knotty, and his cheekbones were marked and prominent. The character of his face was quite Scotch, but there was feeling in his eye, and emotion in his now agitated countenance. His Norman accent in speaking harmonised with his fine physiognomy. He was at once proud-looking and homely-looking. He laid his hand on the child's uplifted head. She said, "Kiss Polly." He kissed her. I wished she would utter some hysterical cry, so that I might get relief and be at ease. She made wonderfully little noise. She seemed to have got what she wanted, all she wanted, and to be in a trance of content. Neither in mien nor in features was this creature like her sire, and yet she was of his strain. Her mind had been filled from his as the cup from the flagon. Indisputably Mr. Home owned manly self-control, however he might secretly feel on some matters. "Polly," he said, looking down on his little girl, "go into the hall. You will see papa's greatcoat lying on a chair. Put your hand into the pockets. You will find a pocket handkerchief there. Bring it to me." She obeyed, went, and returned deftly and nimbly. He was talking to Mrs. Bretton when she came back, and she waited with the handkerchief in her hand. It was a picture in its way to see her, with her tiny stature and trim, neat shape, standing at his knee. Seeing that he continued to talk, apparently unconscious of her return, she took his hand, opened the unresisting fingers, insinuated into them the handkerchief, and closed them upon it one by one. He still seemed not to see or to feel her, but by and by he lifted her to his knee. She nestled against him, and though neither looked at nor spoke to the other for an hour following, I suppose both were satisfied. During tea, the minute things, movements, and behaviour gave, as usual, full occupation to the eye. First she directed Warren, as he placed the chairs. "Put papa's chair here, and mine near it, between papa and Mrs. Bretton. I must hand his tea." She took her own seat, and beckoned with her hand to her father. "Be near me, as if we were at home, papa." And again, as she intercepted his cup in passing, and would stir the sugar and put in the cream herself, "I always did it for you at home, papa. Nobody could do it as well, not even your own self." Throughout the meal she continued her attentions. Rather absurd they were. The sugar tongs were too wide for one of her hands, and she had to use both in wielding them. The weight of the silver cream ewer, the bread and butter plates, the very cup and saucer, tasked her insufficient strength and dexterity, but she would lift this, hand that, and luckily contrive through it all to break nothing. Candidly speaking, I thought her a little busybody, but her father, blind like other parents, seemed perfectly content to let her wait on him, and even wonderfully soothed by her offices. "She is my comfort," he could not help saying to Mrs. Bretton. That lady had her own comfort and nonpareil on a much larger scale, and for the moment absent, so she sympathised with his foible. This second comfort came on the stage in the course of the evening. I knew this day had been fixed for his return, and was aware that Mrs. Bretton had been expecting him through all its hours. We were seated round the fire after tea, when Graham joined our circle. I should rather say broke it up, for of course his arrival made a bustle, and then, as Mr. Graham was fasting, there was refreshment to be provided. He and Mr. Home met as old acquaintance. Of the little girl he took no notice for a time. His meal over, and numerous questions from his mother answered, he turned from the table to the hearth. Opposite, where he had placed himself, was seated Mr. Home, and at his elbow the child. When I say child, I use an inappropriate and undescriptive term, a term suggesting any picture rather than that of the demure little person in a morning frock and white chemisette, that might just have fitted a good-sized doll, perched now on a high chair beside a stand, whereon was her toy workbox of white varnished wood, and holding in her hands a shred of handkerchief, which she was professing to hem, and at which she bored perseveringly with a needle, that in her fingers seemed almost a skewer, pricking herself ever and anon, marking the cambric with a track of minute red dots, occasionally starting when the perverse weapon, swerving from her control, inflicted a deeper stab than usual, but still silent, diligent, absorbed, womanly. Graham was at that time a handsome, faithless-looking youth of 16. I say faithless-looking, not because he was really a very perfidious disposition, but because the epithet strikes me as proper to describe the fair Celtic, not Saxon, character of his good looks. His waved light auburn hair, his supple symmetry, his smile frequent and destitute neither of fascination nor of subtlety, in no bad sense. A spoiled, whimsical boy he was in those days. "Mother," he said, after eyeing the little figure before him in silence for some time, and when the temporary absence of Mr. Home from the room relieved him from the half-laughing bashfulness which was all he knew of timidity, "Mother, I see a young lady in the present society to whom I have not been introduced." "Mr. Home's little girl, I suppose you mean," said his mother. "Indeed, ma'am," replied her son, "I consider your expression of the least ceremonious. Miss Home, I should certainly have said, in venturing to speak of the gentlewoman to whom I allude." "Now, Graham, I will not have that child teased. Don't flatter yourself that I shall suffer you to make her your butt." "Miss Home," pursued Graham, undeterred by his mother's remonstrance, "might I have the honour to introduce myself, since no one else seems willing to render you and me that service? Your slave, John Graham Bretton." She looked at him. He rose and bowed quite gravely. She deliberately put down thimble, scissors, work, descended with precaution from her perch, and curtsying with unspeakable seriousness, said, "How do you do? I have the honour to be in fair health, only in some measure fatigued with the hurried journey. I hope, ma'am, I see you well." "Tolerably well," was the ambitious reply of the little woman, and she now essayed to regain her former elevation, but finding this could not be done without some climbing and straining, a sacrifice of decorum not to be thought of, and being utterly disdainful of aid in the presence of a strange young gentleman, she relinquished the high chair for a low stool. Towards that low stool Graham drew in his chair. "I hope, ma'am, the present residence, my mother's house, appears to you a convenient place of abode." "Not particularly. I want to go home." "A natural and laudable desire, ma'am, but one which, notwithstanding, I shall do my best to oppose. I reckon on being able to get out of you a little of that precious commodity called amusement, which mamma and Mistress Snow there fail to yield me. I shall have to go with papa soon. I shall not stay long at your mother's." "Yes, yes, you will stay with me, I am sure. I have a pony on which you shall ride, and no end of books with pictures to show you." "Are you going to live here now?" "I am. Does that please you? Do you like me?" "No." "Why?" "I think you queer." "My face, ma'am?" "Your face and all about you. You have long red hair." "Auburn hair, if you please. Mamma calls it auburn or golden, and so do all her friends. But even with my long red hair," and he waved his mane with a sort of triumph, tawny he himself well knew that it was, and he was proud of the leonine hue, "I cannot possibly be queerer than is your ladyship." "You call me queer?" "Certainly. I think I shall go to bed." "A little thing like you ought to have been in bed many hours since, but you probably sat up in the expectation of seeing me." "No, indeed." "You certainly wished to enjoy the pleasure of my society. You knew I was coming home, and would wait to have a look at me." "I sat up for papa, and not for you." "Very good, Miss Home. I am going to be a favourite, preferred before papa soon, I daresay." She wished Mrs. Bretton and myself good night. She seemed hesitating whether Graham's deserts entitled him to the same attention, when he caught her up with one hand, and with that one hand held her poised aloft above his head. She saw herself thus lifted up on high in the glass over the fireplace. The suddenness, the freedom, the disrespect of the action were too much. "For shame, Mr. Graham!" was her indignant cry. "Put me down." And when again on her feet, "I wonder what you would think of me if I were to treat you in that way, lifting you with my hand," raising that mighty member, "as Warren lifts the little cat." So saying, she departed. End of chapter 2.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Heather Barnett. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 3. The Playmates. Mr. Holmes stayed 2 days. During his visit he could not be prevailed on to go out. He sat all day long by the fireside, sometimes silent, sometimes receiving and answering Mrs. Bretton's chat, which was just of the proper sort for a man in his morbid mood. Not over-sympathetic, yet not too uncongenial, sensible, and even with a touch of the motherly, she was sufficiently his senior to be permitted this touch. As to Paulina, the child was at once happy and mute, busy and watchful. Her father frequently lifted her to his knee. She would sit there till she felt or fancied he grew restless. Then it was, "Papa, put me down, I shall tire you with my weight." And the mighty burden slid to the rug, and establishing itself on carpet or stool just at Papa's feet, the white work-box and the scarlet speckled handkerchief came into play. This handkerchief, it seems, was intended as a keepsake for Papa, and must be finished before his departure. Consequently the demand on the seamstress's industry (she accomplished about a score of stitches in half an hour) was stringent. The evening, by restoring Graham to the maternal roof (his days were passed at school), brought us an accession of animation, a quality not diminished by the nature of the scenes, pretty sure to be enacted between himself and Miss Paulina. A distant and haughty demeanour had been the result of the indignity put upon her the first evening of his arrival. Her usual manner when he addressed her was, "I can't attend to you. I have other things to think about." Being implored to state what things? Business. Graham would endeavour to seduce her attention by opening his desk, and displaying its multifarious contents: seals, bright sticks of wax, penknives, with a miscellany of engravings, some of them gaily coloured, which he had amassed from time to time. Nor was this powerful temptation wholly unavailing. Her eyes, furtively raised from her work, cast many a peep towards the writing-table, rich in scattered pictures. An etching of a child playing with a Blenheim spaniel happened to flutter to the floor. "Pretty little dog," said she, delighted. Graham prudently took no notice. Ere long, stealing from her corner, she approached to examine the treasure more closely. The dog's great eyes and long ears, and the child's hat and feathers, were irresistible. "Nice picture," was her favourable criticism. "Well, you may have it," said Graham. She seemed to hesitate. The wish to possess was strong, but to accept would be a compromise of dignity. No, she put it down and turned away. "You won't have it then, Polly?" "I would rather not, thank you." "Shall I tell you what I will do with the picture if you refuse it?" She half turned to listen. "Cut it into strips for lighting the taper." "No." "But I shall." "Please don't." Graham waxed inexorable on hearing the pleading tone. He took the scissors from his mother's work-basket. "Here goes," said he, making a menacing flourish, "right through Fido's head and splitting little Harry's nose." "No, no, no!" "Then come to me, come quickly, or it is done." She hesitated, lingered, but complied. "Now will you have it?" he asked, as she stood before him. "Please." "But I shall want payment." "How much?" "A kiss." "Give the picture first into my hand." Polly, as she said this, looked rather faithless in her turn. Graham gave it. She absconded a debtor, darted to her father, and took refuge on his knee. Graham rose in mimic wrath and followed. She buried her face in Mr. Holmes' waistcoat. "Papa, papa, send him away." "I'll not be sent away," said Graham. With face still averted, she held out her hand to keep him off. "Then I shall kiss the hand," said he, but that moment it became a miniature fist, and dealt him payment in a small coin that was not kisses. Graham, not failing in his way to be wily as his little playmate, retreated apparently quite discomfited. He flung himself on a sofa, and resting his head against the cushion, lay like one in pain. Polly, finding him silent, presently peeped at him. His eyes and face were covered with his hands. She turned on her father's knee and gazed at her foe anxiously and long. Graham groaned. "Papa, what is the matter?" she whispered. "You had better ask him, Polly." "Is he hurt?" Groan second. "He makes a groan as if he were," said Mr. Home. "Mother," suggested Graham feebly, "I think you had better send for the doctor. Oh, my eye!" Renewed silence, broken only by sighs from Graham. "If I were to become blind," suggested this last. His chastiser could not bear the suggestion. She was beside him directly. "Let me see your eye. I did not mean to touch it, only your mouth, and I did not think I hit it so very hard." Silence answered her. Her features worked. "I am sorry, I am sorry." Then succeeded emotion, faltering, weeping. "Have done trying that child, Graham," said Mrs. Bretton. "It is all nonsense, my pet," cried Mr. Home. And Graham once more snatched her aloft, and she again punished him, and while she pulled his lion's locks, termed him the naughtiest, rudest, worst, untruest person that ever was. On the morning of Mr. Home's departure, he and his daughter had some conversation in a window recess by themselves. I heard part of it. "Couldn't I pack my box and go with you, papa?" she whispered earnestly. He shook his head. "Should I be a trouble to you?" "Yes, Polly." "Because I am little?" "Because you are little and tender. It is only great, strong people that should travel. But don't look sad, my little girl. It breaks my heart. Papa will soon come back to his Polly." "Indeed, indeed, I am not sad, scarcely at all." "Polly would be sorry to give papa pain, would she not?" "Sorrier than sorry." "Then Polly must be cheerful, not crying at parting, not fret afterwards. She must look forward to meeting again, and try to be happy meanwhile. Can she do this?" "She will try." "I see she will. Farewell, then. It is time to go." "Now? Just now?" "Just now." She held up quivering lips. Her father sobbed, but she, I remarked, did not. Having put her down, he shook hands with the rest present, and departed. When the street door closed, she dropped on her knees at a chair with a cry, "Papa!" It was low and long, a sort of "Why hast thou forsaken me?" During an ensuing space of some minutes, I perceived she endured agony. She went through, in that brief interval of her infant life, emotions such as some never feel. It was in her constitution. She would have more of such instants if she lived. Nobody spoke. Mrs. Bretton, being a mother, shed a tear or two. Graham, who was writing, lifted his eyes and gazed at her. I, Lucy Snowe, was calm. The little creature, thus left unharassed, did for herself what none other could do. Contended with an intolerable feeling, and ere long, in some degree, repressed it. That day she would accept solace from none, nor the next day. She grew more passive afterwards. On the third evening, as she sat on the floor, worn and quiet, Graham coming in, took her up gently, without a word. She did not resist. She rather nestled in his arms, as if weary. When he sat down, she laid her head against him. In a few minutes she slept. He carried her upstairs to bed. I was not surprised that, the next morning, the first thing she demanded was, "Where is Mr. Graham?" It happened that Graham was not coming to the breakfast table. He had some exercises to write for that morning's class, and had requested his mother to send up a cup of tea into the study. Polly volunteered to carry it. She must be busy about something, look after somebody. The cup was entrusted to her, for if restless, she was also careful. As the study was opposite the breakfast room, the doors facing across the passage, my eye followed her. "What are you doing?" she asked, pausing on the threshold. "Writing," said Graham. "Why don't you come to take breakfast with your mamma?" "Too busy." "Do you want any breakfast?" "Of course." "There, then." And she deposited the cup on the carpet, like a jailer putting a prisoner's pitcher of water through his cell door, and retreated. Presently she returned. "What else will you have besides tea? What to eat?" "Anything good. Bring me something particularly nice. That's a kind little woman." She came back to Mrs. Bretton. "Please, ma'am, send your boy something good." "You shall choose for him, Polly. What shall my boy have?" She selected a portion of whatever was best at the table, and ere long came back with a whispered request for some marmalade, which was not there. Having got it, however, for Mrs. Bretton refused the pair nothing, Graham was shortly after heard lauding her to the skies, promising that, when he had a house of his own, she should be his housekeeper, and perhaps, if she showed any culinary genius, his cook. And as she did not return, and I went to look after her, I found Graham and her breakfasting tête à tête. she standing at his elbow and sharing his fare, excepting the marmalade, which she delicately refused to touch, lest I suppose it should appear that she had procured it as much on her account as his. She constantly evinced these nice perceptions and delicate instincts. The league of acquaintanceship thus struck up was not hastily dissolved. On the contrary, it appeared that time and circumstance served rather to cement than loosen it. Ill assimilated as the two were in age, sex, pursuits, and etc., they somehow found a great deal to say to each other. As to Paulina, I observed that her little character never properly came out, except with young Bretton. As she got settled and accustomed to the house, she proved tractable enough with Mrs. Bretton, but she would sit on a stool at the lady's feet all day long, learning her task, or sewing, or drawing figures with a pencil on a slate, and never kindling once to originality, or showing a single gleam of the peculiarities of her nature. I ceased to watch her under such circumstances. She was not interesting, but the moment Graham's knock sounded of an evening, a change occurred. She was instantly at the head of the staircase. Usually her welcome was a reprimand or a threat. "You have not wiped your shoes properly on the mat. I shall tell your mamma." "Little busybody, are you there?" "Yes, and you can't reach me. I am higher up than you." Peeping between the rails of the banister, she could not look over them. "Polly!" "My dear boy!" Such was one of her terms for him, adopted in imitation of his mother. "I am fit to faint with fatigue," declared Graham, leaning against the passage wall in seeming exhaustion. "Dr. Digby, the headmaster, has quite knocked me up with overwork. Just come down and help me to carry up my books." "Ah, you're cunning." "Not at all, Polly. It is a positive fact. I'm as weak as a rush. Come down." "Your eyes are quite like the cat's, but you'll spring." "Spring? Nothing of the kind. It isn't in me. Come down." "Perhaps I may, if you'll promise not to touch, not to snatch me up, and not to whirl me round." "I couldn't do it," sinking into a chair. "Then put the books down on the first step, and go 3 yards off." This being done, she descended warily, and not taking her eyes from the feeble Graham. Of course her approach always galvanized him to new and spasmodic life. The game of romps was sure to be exacted. Sometimes she would be angry, sometimes the matter was allowed to pass smoothly, and we could hear her say, as she led him upstairs, "Now, my dear boy, come and take your tea. I am sure you must want something." It was sufficiently comical to observe her as she sat beside Graham, while he took that meal. In his absence she was a still personage, but with him the most officious, fidgety little body possible. I often wished she could mind herself and be tranquil, but no, herself was forgotten in him. He could not be sufficiently well waited on, nor carefully enough looked after. He was more than the Grand Turk in her estimation. She would gradually assemble the various plates before him, and when one would suppose all he could possibly desire was within reach, she would find out something else. "Ma'am," she would whisper to Mrs. Bretton, "perhaps your son would like a little cake, sweet cake, you know. There is some in there," pointing to the sideboard cupboard. Mrs. Bretton, as a rule, disapproved of sweet cake at tea, but still the request was urged. "One little piece, one for him. As he goes to school, girls such as me and Miss Snow don't need treats, but he would like it." Graham did like it very well, and almost always got it. To do him justice, he would have shared his prize with her to whom he owed it, but that was never allowed. To insist was to ruffle her for the evening; to stand by his knee and monopolize his talk and notice was the reward she wanted, not a share of the cake. With curious readiness did she adapt herself to such themes as interested him. One would have thought the child had no mind or life of her own, but must necessarily live, move, and have her being in another. Now that her father was taken from her, she nestled to Graham, and seemed to feel by his feelings, to exist in his existence. She learned the names of all his schoolfellows in a trice. She got by heart their characters as given from his lips. A single description of an individual seemed to suffice. She never forgot or confused identities. She would talk with him the whole evening about people she had never seen, and appear completely to realize their aspect, manners, and disposition. Some she learned to mimic, An undermaster, which was an aversion of young Bretton's, had, it seems, some peculiarities, which she caught up in a moment from Graham's representation, and rehearsed for his amusement. This, however, Mrs. Bretton disapproved and forbade. The pair seldom quarrelled, yet once a rupture occurred, in which her feelings received a severe shock. One day Graham, on the occasion of his birthday, had some friends, lads of his own age, to dine with him. Paulina took much interest in the coming of these friends. She had frequently heard of them; they were amongst those of whom Graham oftenest spoke. After dinner the young gentlemen were left by themselves in the dining-room, where they soon became very merry and made a good deal of noise. Chancing to pass through the hall, I found Paulina sitting alone on the lowest step of the staircase, her eyes fixed on the glossy panels of the dining-room, where the reflection of the hall lamp was shining, her little brow knit in anxious meditation. "What are you thinking about, Polly?" "Nothing particular, only I wish that door was clear glass, that I might see through it. The boys seem very cheerful, and I want to go to them. I want to be with Graham and watch his friends." "What hinders you from going?" "I feel afraid, but may I try, do you think? May I knock at the door and ask to be let in?" I thought perhaps they might not object to have her as a playmate, and therefore encouraged the attempt. She knocked too faintly at first to be heard, but on a second essay the door unclosed. Graham's head appeared; he looked in high spirits, but impatient. "What do you want, little monkey?" "To come to you." "Do you indeed? As if I would be troubled with you. Away to mamma and Mistress Snowe, and tell them to put you to bed." The auburn head and bright flushed face vanished. The door was shut peremptorily. She was stunned. "Why does he speak so? He has never spoke so before," she said in consternation. "What have I done?" "Nothing, Polly, but Graham is busy with his school friends." "And he likes them better than me. He turns me away now they are here." I had some thoughts of consoling her, and of improving the occasion by inculcating some of those maxims of philosophy whereof I have ever a tolerable stock ready for application. She stopped me, however, by putting her fingers in her ears at the first words I uttered, and then lying down on the mat with her face against the flags. Nor could either Warren or the cook root her from that position. She was allowed to lie, therefore, till she chose to rise of her own accord. Graham forgot his impatience the same evening, and would have accosted her as usual when his friends were gone, but she wrenched herself from his hand. Her eye quite flashed. She would not bid him good night. She would not look in his face. The next day he treated her with indifference, and she grew like a bit of marble. The day after, he teased her to know what was the matter. Her lips would not unclose. Of course he could not feel real anger on his side. The match was too unequal in every way. He tried soothing and coaxing. Why was she so angry? What had he done? By and by tears answered him. He petted her, and they were friends. But she was one on whom such incidents were not lost. I remarked that never after this rebuff did she seek him, or follow him, or in any way solicit his notice. I told her once to carry a book or some other article to Graham when he was shut up in his study. "I shall wait till he comes out," said she proudly. "I don't choose to give him the trouble of rising to open the door." Young Bretton had a favourite pony on which he often rode out. From the window she always watched his departure and return. It was her ambition to be permitted to have a ride round the courtyard on this pony, but far be it from her to ask such a favour. One day she had descended to the yard to watch him dismount. As she leaned against the gate, the longing wish for the indulgence of a ride glittered in her eye. "Come, Polly, will you have a canter?" asked Graham, half carelessly. I suppose she thought he was too careless. "No, thank you," said she, turning away with the utmost coolness. "You'd better," pursued he. "You will like it, I am sure." "Don't think I should care a fig about it," was the response. "That is not true. You told Lucy Snowe you longed to have a ride." "Lucy Snowe is a tatterbox," I heard her say. Her imperfect articulation was the least precocious thing she had about her. And with this she walked into the house. Graham, coming in soon after, observed to his mother, "Mamma, I believe that creature is a changeling. She is a perfect cabinet of oddities. But I should be dull without her. She amuses me a great deal more than you or Lucy Snowe." "Miss Snowe," said Paulina to me. She had now got into the habit of occasionally chatting with me when we were alone in our room at night. Do you know on what day in the week I like Graham best?" "How can I possibly know anything so strange? Is there one day out of the 7 when he is otherwise than on the other 6? "To be sure. Can't you see? Don't you know? I find him most excellent on Sunday. Then we have him the whole day, and he is quiet, and in the evening so kind." This observation was not altogether groundless. Going to church and etc. kept Graham quiet on the Sunday, and the evening he generally dedicated to a serene though rather indolent sort of enjoyment by the parlour fireside. He would take possession of the couch, and then would call Polly. Graham was a boy not quite as other boys are. All his delight did not lie in action. He was capable of some intervals of contemplation. He could take a pleasure, too, in reading, nor was his selection of books wholly indiscriminate. There were glimmerings of characteristic preference, and even of instinctive taste in the choice. He rarely, it is true, remarked on what he read, but I have seen him sit and think of it. Polly being near him, kneeling on a little cushion or the carpet, a conversation would begin in murmurs, not inaudible, though subdued. I caught a snatch of their tenor now and then, and in truth, some influence better and finer than that of every day seemed to soothe Graham at such times in no ungentle mood. "Have you learned any hymns this week, Polly?" "I have learned a very nice pretty one, 4 verses long. Shall I say it?" "Speak nicely, then. Don't be in a hurry." The hymn being rehearsed, or rather half chanted, in a little singing voice, Graham would take exceptions at the manner, and proceeded to give a lesson in recitation. She was quick in learning, apt in imitating, and besides her pleasure was to please Graham. She proved a ready scholar. To the hymn would succeed some reading, perhaps a chapter in the Bible. Correction was seldom required there, for the child could read any simple narrative chapter very well, and when the subject was such as she could understand and take interest in, her expression and emphasis were something remarkable. Joseph cast into the pit, the calling of Samuel, Daniel in the lion's den, these were favourite passages. Of the first especially she seemed perfectly to feel the pathos. "Poor Jacob," she would sometimes say, with quivering lips, "how he loved his son Joseph! As much," she once added, "as much, Graham, as I love you. If you were to die—" and she reopened the book, sought the verse, and read, "I should refuse to be comforted, and go down into the grave to you mourning." With these words she gathered Graham in her little arms, drawing his long tressed head towards her. The action, I remember, struck me as strangely rash, exciting the feeling one might experience on seeing an animal dangerous by nature, and but half tamed by art, too heedlessly fondled. Not that I feared Graham would hurt or very roughly check her, but I thought she ran risk of incurring such a careless, impatient repulse, as would be worse almost to her than a blow. On the whole, however, these demonstrations were borne passively. Sometimes even a sort of complacent wonder at her earnest partiality would smile not unkindly in his eyes. Once he said, "You like me almost as well as if you were my own little sister, Polly." "Oh, I do like you," she said. "I do like you very much." I was not long allowed the amusement of this study of character. She had scarcely been at Bretton 2 months when a letter came from Mr. Home, signifying that he was now settled amongst his maternal kinsfolk on the continent, that, as England was becoming wholly distasteful to him, he had no thoughts of returning hither, perhaps for years, and that he wished his little girl to join him immediately. "I wonder how she will take the news," said Mrs. Bretton, when she had read the letter. I too wondered, and I took upon myself to communicate it. Repairing to the drawing-room, in which calm and decorated apartment she was fond of being alone, and where she could be implicitly trusted, for she fingered nothing, or rather soiled nothing she fingered, I found her seated, like a little odalisque, on a couch half shadowed by the drooping draperies of the window near. She seemed happy. All her appliances for occupation were about her. The white wood work-box, a shred or two of muslin, an end or two of ribbon collected for conversation into doll millinery. The doll, duly night-capped and night-gowned, lay in its cradle. She was rocking it to sleep, with an air of the most perfect faith in its possession of sentient and somnolent faculties, her eyes at the same time being engaged with the picture-book, which lay open on her lap. "Miss Snowe," she said in a whisper, "this is a wonderful book. Candace." The doll, christened by Graham, for indeed its begrimed complexion gave it much of an Ethiopian aspect, Candace is asleep now, and I may tell you about it. Only we must speak low, lest she should waken. This book was given me by Graham. It tells about distant countries, a long, long way from England, which no traveller can reach without sailing thousands of miles over the sea. Wild men live in these countries, Miss Snow, who wear clothes different from ours. Indeed, some of them wear scarcely any clothes, for the sake of being cool, you know, for they have very hot weather. Here is a picture of thousands gathered in a desolate place, a plain spread with sand, round a man in black, a good, good Englishman, a missionary, who is preaching to them under a palm tree. She showed a little coloured cut to that effect. And here are pictures, she went on, more stranger (grammar was occasionally forgotten) than that. There is the wonderful Great Wall of China. Here is a Chinese lady with a foot littler than mine. There is a wild horse of Tartary. And here, most strange of all, is a land of ice and snow, without green fields, woods, or gardens. In this land they found some mammoth bones. There are no mammoths now. You don't know what it was, but I can tell you because Graham told me. A mighty goblin creature, as high as this room, and as long as the hall, but not a fierce, flesh-eating thing, Graham thinks. He believes if I met one in a forest it would not kill me, unless I came quite in its way, when it would trample me down amongst the bushes, as I might tread on a grasshopper in a hayfield without knowing it. Thus she rambled on. "Polly," I interrupted, "should you like to travel?" "Not just yet," was the prudent answer, "but perhaps in 20 years, when I am a grown woman, as tall as Mrs. Bretton, I may travel with Graham. We intend going to Switzerland and climbing Mont Blanc, and some day we shall sail over to South America and walk to the top of Kim Kim Borazo." "But how would you like to travel now, if your papa was with you?" Her reply, not given till after a pause, evinced one of these unexpected turns of temper peculiar to her. "Where is the good of talking in that silly way?" said she. "Why do you mention papa? What is papa to you? I was just beginning to be happy and not think about him so much, and there it will be all to do over again." Her lip trembled. I hastened to disclose the fact of a letter having been received, and to mention the directions given that she and Harriet should immediately rejoin this dear papa. "Now, Polly, are you not glad?" I added. She made no answer. She dropped her book and ceased to rock her doll. She gazed at me with gravity and earnestness. "Shall not you like to go to papa?" "Of course," she said at last in that trenchant manner she usually employed in speaking to me, and which was quite different from that she used with Mrs. Bretton, and different again from the one dedicated to Graham. I wished to ascertain more of what she thought, but no, she would converse no more. Hastening to Mrs. Bretton, she questioned her, and received the confirmation of my news. The weight and importance of these tidings kept her perfectly serious the whole day. In the evening, at the moment Graham's entrance was heard below, I found her at my side. She began to arrange a locket ribbon about my neck. She displaced and replaced the comb in my hair. While thus busied, Graham entered. "Tell him by and by," she whispered. "Tell him I am going." In the course of tea time I made the desired communication. Graham, it chanced, was at that time greatly preoccupied about some school prize for which he was competing. The news had to be told twice before it took proper hold of his attention, and even then he dwelt on it but momently. "Polly going? What a pity! Dear little mousie! I shall be sorry to lose her. She must come to us again, mamma." And hastily swallowing his tea, he took a candle and a small table to himself and his books, and was soon buried in study. Little Mousie crept to his side and lay down on the carpet at his feet, her face to the floor. Mute and motionless she kept that post and position till bedtime. Once I saw Graham, wholly unconscious of her proximity, push her with his restless foot. She receded an inch or two. A minute after, one little hand stole out from beneath her face, to which it had been pressed, and softly caressed the heedless foot. When summoned by her nurse she rose and departed very obediently, having bid us all a subdued good night. I will not say that I dreaded going to bed an hour later, yet I certainly went with an unquiet anticipation that I should find that child in no peaceful sleep. The forewarning of my instinct was but fulfilled, when I discovered her, all cold and vigilant, perched like a white bird on the outside of the bed. I scarcely knew how to accost her. She was not to be managed like another child. She, however, accosted me. As I closed the door and put the light on the dressing-table, she turned to me with these words: "I cannot sleep, and in this way I cannot live." I asked her what ailed her. "Dreadful misery," said she, with her piteous lisp. "Shall I call Mrs. Bretton?" "That is downright silly," was her impatient reply; and indeed I well knew that if she had heard Mrs. Bretton's foot approach, she would have nestled quiet as a mouse under the bedclothes. Whilst lavishing her eccentricities regardless before me, for whom she professed scarcely the semblance of affection, she never showed my godmother one glimpse of her inner self. For her she was nothing but a docile, somewhat quaint little maiden. I examined her: her cheek was crimson. Her dilated eye was both troubled and glowing, and painfully restless. In this state it was obvious she must not be left till morning. I guessed how the case stood. "Would you like to bid Graham good night again?" I asked. "He is not gone to his room yet." She at once stretched out her little arms to be lifted. Folding a shawl round her, I carried her back to the drawing-room. Graham was just coming out. "She cannot sleep without seeing and speaking to you once more," I said. "She does not like the thought of leaving you." "I've spoilt her," said he, taking her from me with good humour, and kissing her little hot face and burning lips. "Polly, you care for me more than for papa now." "I do care for you, but you care nothing for me," was her whisper. She was assured to the contrary, again kissed, restored to me, and I carried her away, but alas, not soothed. When I thought she could listen to me, I said, "Paulina, you should not grieve that Graham does not care for you so much as you care for him. It must be so." Her lifted and questioning eyes asked why. "Because he is a boy and you are a girl. He is 16 and you are 6. His nature is strong and gay, and yours is otherwise." "But I do love him so much. He should love me a little." "He does. He is fond of you. You are his favourite." "Am I Graham's favourite?" "Yes, more than any little child I know." The assurance soothed her. She smiled in her anguish. "But," I continued, "don't fret, and don't expect too much of him, or else he will feel you to be troublesome, and then it is all over." "All over?" she echoed softly. "Then I'll be good. I'll try to be good, Lucy Snowe." I put her to bed. "Will he forgive me this one time?" she asked, as I undressed myself. I assured her that he would; that as yet he was by no means alienated; that she had only to be careful for the future. "There is no future," said she. "I am going. Shall I ever see him again, after I leave England?" I returned an encouraging response. The candle being extinguished, a still half-hour elapsed. I thought her asleep, when the little white shape once more lifted itself in the crib, and the small voice asked, "Do you like Graham, Miss Snowe?" "Like him? Yes, a little." "Only a little? Do you like him as I do?" "I think not. No, not as you do." "Do you like him much?" "I told you I liked him a little. Where is the use of caring for him so very much? He is full of faults." "Is he? All boys are." "More than girls?" "Very likely. Wise people say it is folly to think anybody perfect; and as to likes and dislikes, we should be friendly to all and worship none." "Are you a wise person?" "I mean to try to be so. Go to sleep." "I cannot go to sleep. Have you no pain just here?" laying her elfish hand on her elfish breast. "When you think you shall have to leave Graham, for your home is not here?" "Surely, Polly," said I, "you should not feel so much pain when you are very soon going to rejoin your father. Have you forgotten him? Do you no longer wish to be his little companion?" Dead silence succeeded this question. "Child, lie down and sleep," I urged. "My bed is cold," said she. "I can't warm it." I saw the little thing shiver. "Come to me," I said, wishing, yet scarcely hoping, that she would comply, for she was a most strange, capricious little creature, and especially whimsical with me. She came, however, instantly, like a small ghost gliding over the carpet. I took her in. She was chill. I warmed her in my arms. She trembled nervously. I soothed her. Thus tranquillized and cherished, she at last slumbered. A very unique child, thought I, as I viewed her sleeping countenance by the fitful moonlight, and cautiously and softly wiped her glittering eyelids and her wet cheeks with my handkerchief. How will she get through this world, or battle with this life? How will she bear with the shocks and repulses, the humiliations and desolations which books, and my own reason, tell me are prepared for all flesh? She departed the next day, trembling like a leaf when she took leave, but exercising self-command. End of chapter 3.
Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tay Jensen. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 4. Miss Marchmont. On quitting Bretton, which I did a few weeks after Paulina's departure, little thinking then I was never again to visit it, never more to tread its calm old streets, I betook myself home, having been absent 6 months. It will be conjectured that I was, of course, glad to return to the bosom of my kindred. Well, the amiable conjecture does no harm, and may therefore be safely left uncontradicted. Far from saying nay, indeed, I will permit the reader to picture me, for the next 8 years, as a bark slumbering through halcyon weather, in a harbour still as glass, the steersman stretched on the little deck, his face up to heaven, his eyes closed, buried, if you will, in a long prayer. A great many women and girls are supposed to pass their lives something in that fashion. Why not I with the rest? Picture me then, idle, basking, plump, and happy, stretched on a cushioned deck, warmed with constant sunshine, rocked by breezes, indolently soft. However, it cannot be concealed that, in that case, I must somehow have fallen overboard, or that there must have been wreck at last. I too well remember a time, a long time, of cold, of danger, of contention. To this hour, when I have the nightmare, it repeats the rush and saltness of briny waves in my throat, and their icy pressure on my lungs. I even know there was a storm, and that not of 1 hour nor 1 day. For many days and nights neither sun nor stars appeared. We cast with our own hands the tackling out of the ship. A heavy tempest lay on us. All hope that we should be saved was taken away. In fine, the ship was lost. The crew perished. As far as I recollect, I complained to no one about these troubles. Indeed, to whom could I complain? Of Mrs. Bretton I had long lost sight. Impediments raised by others had, years ago, come in the way of our intercourse, and cut it off. Besides, time had brought changes for her too. The handsome property of which she was left guardian for her son, and which had been chiefly invested in some joint stock undertaking, had melted, it was said, to a fraction of its original amount. Graham, I learned from incidental rumours, had adopted a profession. Both he and his mother were gone from Bretton, and were understood to be now in London. Thus there remained no possibility of dependence on others. To myself alone could I look. I know not that I was of a self-reliant or active nature, but self-reliance and exertion were forced upon me by circumstances, as they are upon thousands besides. And when Miss Marchmont, a maiden lady of our neighbourhood, sent for me, I obeyed her behest, in the hope that she might assign me some task I could undertake. Miss Marchmont was a woman of fortune, and lived in a handsome residence, but she was a rheumatic cripple, impotent foot and hand, and had been so for 20 years. She always sat upstairs. Her drawing-room adjoined her bedroom. I had often heard of Miss Marchmont, and of her peculiarities. She had the character of being very eccentric, but till now had never seen her. I found her a furrowed, grey-haired woman, grave with solitude, stern with long affliction, irritable also, and perhaps exacting. It seemed that a maid, or rather companion, who had waited on her for some years, was about to be married, and she, hearing of my bereaved lot, had sent for me, with the idea that I might supply this person's place. She made the proposal to me after tea, as she and I sat alone by her fireside. "It will not be an easy life," said she candidly, "for I require a good deal of attention, and you will be much confined. Yet, perhaps, contrasted with the existence you have lately led, it may appear tolerable. I reflected. Of course, it ought to appear tolerable, I argued inwardly, but somehow, by some strange fatality, it would not. To live here, in this close room, the watcher of suffering, sometimes perhaps the butt of temper, through all that was to come of my youth, while all that was gone had passed, to say the least, not blissfully. My heart sunk one moment, then it revived, for though I forced myself to realize evils, I think I was too prosaic to idealize, and consequently to exaggerate them. "My doubt is whether I should have strength for the undertaking," I observed. "That is my own scruple," said she, "for you look a worn-out creature." So I did. I saw myself in the glass in my morning dress, a faded, hollow-eyed vision. Yet I thought little of the wan spectacle. The blight, I believed, was chiefly external. I still felt life at life's sources. "What else have you in view? Anything?" "Nothing clear as yet, but I may find something." "So you imagine. Perhaps you are right. Try your own method, then, and if it does not succeed, test mine. The chance I have offered shall be left open to you for 3 months. This was kind. I told her so, and expressed my gratitude. While I was speaking, a paroxysm of pain came on. I ministered to her, made the necessary applications, according to her directions, and, by the time she was relieved, a sort of intimacy was already formed between us. I, for my part, had learned from the manner in which she bore this attack, that she was a firm, patient woman, patient under physical pain, though sometimes, perhaps, excitable under long mental canker. And she, from the good will with which I succoured her, discovered that she could influence my sympathies, such as they were. She sent for me the next day. For 5 or 6 successive days she claimed my company. Closer acquaintance, while it developed both faults and eccentricities, opened at the same time a view of a character I could respect. Stern and even morose as she sometimes was, I could wait on her and sit beside her, with that calm which always blesses us when we are sensible that our manners, presence, contact, please and soothe the persons we serve. Even when she scolded me, which she did now and then, very tartly, it was in such a way as did not humiliate, and left no sting. It was rather like an irascible mother rating her daughter than a harsh mistress lecturing a dependent. Lecture, indeed, she could not, though she could occasionally storm. Moreover, a vein of reason ever ran through her passion. She was logical even when fierce. Ere long, a growing sense of attachment began to present the thought of staying with her as companion in quite a new light. In another week I had agreed to remain. 2 hot, close rooms thus became my world, and a crippled old woman, my mistress, my friend, my all. Her service was my duty, her pain my suffering, her relief my hope, her anger my punishment, her regard my reward. I forgot that there were fields, woods, rivers, seas, an ever-changing sky outside the steam-dimmed lattice of this sick chamber. I was almost content to forget it. All within me became narrowed to my lot. Tame and still by habit, disciplined by destiny, I demanded no walks in the fresh air. My appetite needed no more than the tiny messes served for the invalid. In addition, she gave me the originality of her character to study, the steadiness of her virtues, I will add, the power of her passions to admire, the truth of her feelings to trust. All these things she had, and for these things I clung to her. For these things I would have crawled on with her for 20 years, if for 20 years longer her life of endurance had been protracted. But another decree was written. It seemed I must be stimulated into action. I must be goaded, driven, stung, forced to energy. My little morsel of human affection, which I prized as if it were a solid pearl, must melt in my fingers and slip thence like a dissolving hailstone. My small adopted duty must be snatched from my easily contented conscience. I had wanted to compromise with fate, to escape occasional great agonies by submitting to a whole life of privation and small pains. Fate would not so be pacified, nor would Providence sanction this shrinking sloth and cowardly indolence. One February night, I remember it well, there came a voice near Miss Marchmont's house, heard by every inmate, but translated, perhaps, only by one. After a calm winter, storms were ushering in the spring. I had put Miss Marchmont to bed. I sat at the fireside sewing. The wind was wailing at the windows. It had wailed all day, but as night deepened, it took a new tone, an accent keen, piercing, almost articulate to the ear, a plaint piteous and disconsolate to the nerves, trilled in every gust. "Oh, hush, hush," I said in my disturbed mind, dropping my work and making a vain effort to stop my ears against that subtle, searching cry. I had heard that very voice ere this, and compulsory observation had forced on me a theory as to what it boded. 3 times in the course of my life, events had taught me that these strange accents in the storm, this restless, hopeless cry, denote a coming state of the atmosphere unpropitious to life. Epidemic diseases, I believed, were often heralded by a gasping, sobbing, tormented, long-lamenting east wind. Hence, I inferred, arose the legend of the banshee. I fancied, too, I had noticed, but was not philosopher enough to know whether there was any connection between the circumstances, that we often at the same time hear of disturbed volcanic action in distant parts of the world, of rivers suddenly rushing above their banks, and of strange high tides flowing furiously in on low sea-coasts. Our globe, I had said to myself, seems at such periods torn and disordered, the feeble amongst us wither in her distempered breath, rushing hot from steaming volcanoes. I listened and trembled. Miss Marchmont slept. About midnight, the storm in 1/2 hour fell to a dead calm. The fire, which had been burning dead, glowed up vividly. I felt the air change and become keen. Raising blind and curtain, I looked out, and saw in the stars the keen sparkle of a sharp frost. Turning away, the object that met my eyes was Miss Marchmont awake, lifting her head from the pillow and regarding me with unusual earnestness. "Is it a fine night?" she asked. I replied in the affirmative. "I thought so," she said, "for I feel so strong, so well. Raise me. I feel young to-night," she continued, "young, light-hearted, and happy. What if my complaint be about to take a turn, and I am yet destined to enjoy health? It would be a miracle." And these are not the days of miracles, I thought to myself, and wondered to hear her talk so. She went on, directing her conversation to the past, and seeming to recall its incidents, scenes, and personages with singular vividness. "I love memory to-night," she said. "I prize her as my best friend. She is just now giving me a deep delight. She is bringing back to my heart, in warm and beautiful life, realities, not mere empty ideas, but what were once realities, and that I long have thought decayed, dissolved, mixed in with grave mould. I possess just now the hours, the thoughts, the hopes of my youth. I renew the love of my life, its only love, almost its only affection, for I am not a particularly good woman. I am not amiable. Yet I have had my feelings strong and concentrated, and these feelings had their object, which in its single self was dear to me, as to the majority of men and women are all the unnumbered points on which they dissipate their regard. While I loved, and while I was loved, what an existence I enjoyed! What a glorious year I can recall! How bright it comes back to me! What a living spring! What a warm, glad summer! What soft moonlight, silvering the autumn evenings! What strength of hope under the ice-bound waters and frost-hoar fields of that year's winter! Through that year my heart lived with Frank's heart. Oh, my noble Frank, my faithful Frank, my good Frank! So much better than myself, his standard in all things so much higher. This I can now see and say. If few women have suffered as I did in his loss, few have enjoyed what I did in his love. It was a far better kind of love than common. I had no doubts about it or him. It was such a love as honoured, protected, and elevated no less than it gladdened her to whom it was given. Let me now ask, just at this moment, when my mind is so strangely clear, let me reflect why it was taken from me. For what crime was I condemned, after 12 months of bliss, to undergo 30 years of sorrow? I do not know, she continued after a pause. I cannot see the reason. Yet at this hour I can say with sincerity what I never tried to say before. Inscrutable God, thy will be done. And at this moment I can believe that death will restore me to Frank. I never believed it till now. He is dead, then? I inquired in a low voice. My dear girl, she said, one happy Christmas Eve I dressed and decorated myself, expecting my lover, very soon to be my husband, would come that night to visit me. I sat down to wait. Once more I see that moment. I see the snow twilight stealing through the window over which the curtain was not dropped, for I designed to watch him ride up the wide walk. I see and feel the soft firelight warming me, playing on my silk dress, and fitfully showing me my own young figure in a glass. I see the moon of a calm winter night float full, clear, and cold over the inky mass of shrubbery, and the silvered turf of my grounds. I wait, with some impatience in my pulse, but no doubt in my breast. The flames had died in the fire, but it was a bright mass yet. The moon was mounting high, but she was still visible from the lattice. The clock neared 10. He rarely tarried later than this, but once or twice he had been delayed so long. Would he for once fail me? No, not even for once, and now he was coming, and coming fast to atone for lost time. "Frank, you furious rider," I said inwardly, listening gladly, yet anxiously to his approaching gallop. "You shall be rebuked for this. I will tell you it is my neck you are putting in peril, for whatever is yours is, in a dearer and tenderer sense, mine." There he was. I saw him, but I think tears were in my eyes, my sight was so confused. I saw the horse, I heard it stamp. I saw at least a mass. I heard a clamour. Was it a horse? Or what heavy, dragging thing was it, crossing strangely dark the lawn? How could I name that thing in the moonlight before me? or how could I utter the feeling which rose in my soul? I could only run out. A great animal, truly Frank's black horse, stood trembling, panting, snorting before the door. A man held it. Frank, as I thought. "What is the matter?" I demanded. Thomas, my own servant, answered by saying sharply, "Go into the house, madam," and then calling to another servant, who came hurrying from the kitchen as if summoned by some instinct. "Ruth, take the missus into the house directly." But I was kneeling down in the snow, beside something that lay there, something that I had seen dragged along the ground, something that sighed, that groaned on my breast as I lifted and drew it to me. He was not dead. He was not quite unconscious. I had him carried in. I refused to be ordered about and thrust from him. I was quite collected enough not only to be my own mistress, but the mistress of others. They had begun by trying to treat me like a child, as they always do with people struck by God's hand. But I gave place to none except the surgeon, and when he had done what he could, I took my dying Frank to myself. He had strength to fold me in his arms. He had power to speak my name. He heard me as I prayed over him very softly. He felt me as I tenderly and fondly comforted him. "Maria," he said, "I am dying in paradise." He spent his last breath in faithful words for me. When the dawn of Christmas morning broke, my Frank was with God. "And that," she went on, "happened 30 years ago. I have suffered since. I doubt if I have made the best use of all my calamities. Soft, amiable natures they would have refined to saintliness. Of strong, evil spirits they would have made demons. As for me, I have only been a woe-struck and selfish woman." "You have done much good," I said, for she was noted for her liberal alms-giving. "I have not withheld money, you mean, where it could assuage affliction." "What of that? It cost me no effort or pang to give. But I think from this day I am about to enter a better frame of mind, to prepare myself for a union with Frank. You see, I still think of Frank more than of God, and unless it be counted that in thus loving the creature so much, so long, and so exclusively, I have not at least blasphemed the Creator, small is my chance of salvation. What do you think, Lucy, of these things? Be my chaplain, and tell me." This question I could not answer. I had no words. It seemed as if she thought I had answered it. "Very right, my child. We should acknowledge God merciful, but not always for us comprehensible. We should accept our own lot, whatever it be, and try to render happy that of others, should we not? Well, tomorrow I will begin by trying to make you happy. I will endeavour to do something for you, Lucy, something that will benefit you when I am dead. My head aches now with talking too much. Still, I am happy. Go to bed. The clock strikes 2. How late you sit up, or rather, how late I, in my selfishness, keep you up. But go now, have no more anxiety for me. I feel I shall rest well." She composed herself as if to slumber. I too retired to my crib in a closet within her room. The night passed in quietness. Quietly, her doom must at last have come. Peacefully and painlessly. In the morning she was found without life, nearly cold, but all calm and undisturbed. Her previous excitement of spirits and change of mood had been the prelude of a fit. One stroke sufficed to sever the thread, of an existence so long fretted by affliction. End of Chapter 4.